Welcome, everyone. My name is Angela Stevens. I am the Vice President of Home Lending here at Incredible Bank. I would like to welcome you to the third and final session of our three-part spring webinar series, kind of surrounding the residential real estate market. Today, our webinar is titled Ask an Appraiser, and I have the pleasure of doing kind of an interview style webinar with Chris Seeliger. Chris is a real estate appraisal partner of Incredible Bank up in the Minocqua market. Chris has called Minocqua home since 1988, and in 2000 he started Seeliger and Seeliger Appraisals with his mother. In 2018, Chris took over ownership of the firm and it became Chris Seeliger Appraisals. He's practiced appraising since 1997 and started full-time in 1999 to the present. His primary focus is on single-family residential homes, with primary business being lender work. So it's a perfect marriage for us. Additional work includes private party appraisals for estate matters, estate planning, and helping owners determine the market value of their property. Chris is a strong believer in trying to keep up with market trends, construction costs and trends, and ever-changing secondary market guidelines, because believe it or not, appraisers also have to follow guidelines just like lenders do. Chris received an associate's degree from UW-Stevens Point and then continued with private appraisal education requirements from the Appraisal Institute. He continued his education and state requirements for apprenticeship hours and became a certified residential appraiser in Wisconsin in January of 2009. So with that, I would like to welcome Chris Seeliger. Thank you for being our resident expert today. And I'm just going to jump into putting you right in the hot seat.
All right,
we've got a lot of different questions that come up throughout the real estate buying, selling, borrowing process. And I just want to be able to throw some questions out there. Kim's going to manage the chat. So those of you that are tuning in out there on the web, please feel free to use the chat function if you have a question. Chris, is it safe to say no question is off limits?
Yeah, I mean, I'll
even value.
Best that I can.
Okay. All right. So we're going to jump into our first topic. I wanted to ask you today, Chris, just can you tell us what is an appraisal and what makes it valuable to us as a lender?
The appraisal is basically a process of coming up with an opinion of value, and it's normally expressed in a numeric form. Why it makes it valuable to the lender is it's a tool for them to decide the risk that they want to take on a borrower and or a property to determine if it's something they want to move forward with as a lender.
So what all goes into building an appraisal? You know, they're 57 to 100 pages long, I feel like.
Yeah, they can typically be between 30 and 40 pages is our normal appraisal. We look at the grid form, which is a secondary market form from Fannie and Freddie. That has multiple pages where it just labels what the property is, some details about the property, condition, quality ratings. We have a little bit of commentary in there, and then we have the comparable section. From there, we have our typical disclaimers. We have commentary about each market that every different appraiser does. We talk about neighborhood within the appraisal, and then just have our addendums that go with it: maps, plat maps, location maps, flood maps, our criteria with regards to our resume, typically our E&O insurance, our license is included in that appraisal.
And so from a licensing standpoint, how do you get a license to be an appraiser?
That is something that kind of keeps evolving and changing. I believe right now to be a certified residential appraiser, you need a 4-year degree from college, plus then your additional appraisal classes, which I believe is close to equivalent to 2 years of credits. And then you need to be an apprentice under somebody for 2,000 hours worth of appraisal work. So actual valuation work. So your 8-hour day doesn't equate to 8 hours of apprenticeship. It's actually working on the valuation of a property that you have to get your 2,000 hours in. And that can't be done less than 2 years.
Wow, so that's a tremendous amount of education. What type of degree? What type of degree do you hold if you know, for your college education?
Typically, they want a finance or marketing business type degree. And then from there, you go into your actual appraisal studies.
The specialty part of it.
Yep.
So what are things that, you know, when it comes to the appraisal, you know, sometimes we need them, sometimes we don't as a lender, sometimes consumers want them if they're selling their property. But what are some things that drive the value on an appraisal? So if we talk about, you know, what's happened over the years, we're hearing now in this current market that values are just out of control. What drives that?
With all that right now, supply and demand is the biggest drive. Typically, that's always a factor in the real estate market. Supply and demand are always somewhat of a driving factor for all real estate. Now,
and what are you seeing right now?
Right now, obviously, there is a high demand. There's a high drive for home ownership. It's starting to slow down right now because of the interest rates are increasing. But that high demand is being met right now with a lack of inventory, not only in our market in Wisconsin, but in the US and even worldwide. There's just a lack of available units available for the number of buyers out there.
Yeah, it's really tough right now. Are there certain things that we always, you know, from my chair as a lender, we always have questions about, or we have commentary from consumers when they're going through the loan process. And they say, well, you know, I added, or we put in new flooring. Good example. Well, we put in new flooring and that cost $10,000. So our appraised value should be $10,000 higher. How do improvements and things like that impact an appraisal as far as value goes?
So that's a challenging question just because it can be very market specified. So certain markets, if people watch all of these home shows and stuff like that, how they put granite countertops in the kitchen, they remodeled it and it automatically adds $5,000 more than what cost they had into it. That might be the case in that market where that show is being recorded, but that may not be the case in every market, every neighborhood, or every property type. We look at, when we come into a property, we look at the age of the property, the updates done to it, the effective age of the property, and then also look at the market trends of what buyers are looking for within that market. So there's a lot that goes into all of that. And there's certain factors that affect certain things. You just said, you know,
Flooring.
maybe I just put a brand new roof on and it just cost me X for that brand new roof. Well, that's not going to necessarily add value directly related to cost to your home. You need a roof, and a roof has to be in at least average condition to be able to be sold and have a loan put on it on the secondary market. So there's certain things that have value, but may not have a value related to the cost of that improvement.
So things like flooring, like windows, like a roof, things that a property is basically required to have don't necessarily bring dollar for dollar value when it comes to upgrades. Is that correct? Is that fair to say?
Yep, that's fair to say. And then there's things that maybe you do a remodel on your house and you have the kitchen done, the dining room, living room, and that's it. And you have a 30-year-old home or a 40-year-old home, but the rest of the house is completely dated still. The market's going to react to that in most cases and saying, okay, half the house is done, but half of it isn't. They're not going to generally give that full value of that half that's been remodeled because the other half still needs to be done. So a lot of buyers out there have what we call either tunnel vision, which they can't see how the other part of the house is going to look, or in today's world where the lenders are backed up, supply chain is backed up with materials, they may not want to move into that home and then try to remodel it once they've moved into it, but they can't do it all at the same time because of the delay in building and supplies.
Yeah.
Well, that
crazy.
plays a factor in the market with regards to, yes, you might have just spent $30,000 on this half house remodel, but you may not get that value all back because it's only been halfway done.
Makes sense. What about a pool? Amenities like a pool, hot tub, things like that. How does that affect the value of a property? Or for instance, up in your neck of the woods, docks, piers, things like that, that are left by the seller.
So in certain markets, obviously, if you go into a pool, that's a factor. You go to Las Vegas, you go to California, you go to Florida, especially. If you don't have a pool, your properties are automatically typically lower. I mean, it's just the requirement of that market that in Florida, you better have a pool and a lanai covering that pool to keep the bugs and debris out of the pool. And so it's just kind of part of that market. Up here in northern Wisconsin, most of Wisconsin, pools aren't that common. So that added value of, if it's going to cost $30,000 in Florida to put a pool in, it's going to cost $30,000 to put a pool in here. You're not going to get $30,000 of value because it's not part of the typical market. Florida, you'll get that. Up here, you wouldn't. So
I've heard sometimes it can actually, yeah, like you just said, lessen your value.
yes. Yep. So if it's not typical then, and it's not something that's expected in the market, typically lenders are going to want something that has that factor or that feature, amenity, as a comparable on the appraisal to show that it does have value or that it has a negative effect on a property. So there's certain things that factor into the specific nature of the market that you're in. So it's kind of a loaded question, but if you like to, for our area where we have as many lakes and everything like that, docks are expected to be included in the price. Most people aren't selling a lake home, or if they are selling a lake home, they're not going, if they're going to another lake home, that property already has a dock, and they're not going to take the dock with them if they're selling and not moving back on water because there's no need for it. So that amenity is normally left and just part of the transaction.
Does it add value?
No, we don't have any market data to show that this dock versus that dock versus this dock has any added value one way or the other. There's definitely cost factors there, but I don't have the data to prove a 30-foot dock, a flow dock, is less than a 40-foot Aqualand dock or Northland dock. So there's just no data for that. It's just something that's expected.
So if we talk about comparables, you brought up comparable sales, and that's another conundrum that we as lenders sometimes get into because we'll get an appraisal report in and there'll be specific comparable sales, maybe 3 or 4. First of all, I guess, why do we need comparable sales? And then how do you go about sourcing that information to use in that report?
So the importance of a comparable is to show what the market reaction is to hopefully the most comparable property that the borrower is either buying or is refinancing or loaning against or whatever. So it's a way to show this is what is going on in the market right now for homes of this nature. So it gives a base price. It also can give a high and a low value factor that we as appraisers use to determine, okay, what's the reaction to this? And then we also look at those comparables as what's the reaction to, a home being remodeled versus one that's not within that market area. So then within that market area that's our neighborhood and that's our search criteria. With that, Fannie and Freddie have guidelines that we have to follow for that criteria of the neighborhood. And then on top of that, certain lenders have even more defined criteria. And so a lot of consumers don't understand that, A, what actual comparable is, and B, how we choose those comparables. Most lenders allow us to go back 1 year for comparables. Some lenders are 6 months only. Some lenders are 3 months only.
And that's a sale date, correct?
Correct.
It's so 12 months from the previous sale date.
Yep. Sale date to the effective date of the appraisal. And so there are certain criteria that, yes, there might have been a sale year and a half ago down the road. We can use that as our data point and verification, but we may not be able to use that comp on the actual appraisal based on the requirements of time. And or in some cases, there's a lot of lenders that also have distance requirements. So we can't use a comp that's more than 10 miles away or 3 miles away or 1 mile away, depending on the market that you live in.
If you're in a rural market, does that change?
The guidelines for a rural market are still 10 miles for a comparable, but in certain markets, that's just not even realistic. And so in our appraisal, we'll expand why we're choosing comparables at a further distance and what constitute it as an acceptable comparable being in a different location.
So when you're looking at those comparables, then how do you know if it's a comparable? Are you looking at square footage? What are you looking at when you're determining which property would be comparable? Because you're not going into all of these properties, right?
Correct. In our market, I'm fortunate enough that I do a vast majority of purchases in the coverage area that I'm in. So I am lucky enough that I get to see most of the homes that I'm using as comparables, either from a purchase standpoint or that I've done them before as a refinance. But typically speaking, no, we've not been in the comparables. And so our process is we gather the data on the subject property, and we are looking at quality, condition, age, effective age, amenities. You have square footage, you have below grade square footage, below grade finishings, and then just the property as a whole. Is it an acreage tract? Is it a waterfront tract? So then we try to take that data and do a search within the market for similar homes that offer some of those similar features. And there's a lot of cases where we might use pull a comparable. It may not be used on the appraisal, but we pull it, we look at it, and maybe it's a superior dwelling that's sold for a higher price. We might do the same thing with a inferior dwelling that's sold for a lower price and say, okay, what's the difference between these two? And how do they compare to the subject? And then how would the subject adjust out to the superior home or this inferior home to come up with a valuation? Typically speaking, you guys as the lenders see the appraisal and it might have 3, 4, 5 comparables, but in most cases, we're actually probably trying 10, 12, 15 comparables within the appraisal. And then we actually lay those all out and see which ones make the most sense to what the property is and also what the current market trends are.
So once you do, you do the inspection, so that's a piece of this process. Then the appraisal is done the next day, or how does that work?
That's a tricky question because that's depending on the market. In my market up here in Minocqua, we do a majority of second homes and waterfront homes. My typical time on an appraisal from start to finish, from when we get the order from the lender to us submitting it to the lender, is anywhere between 8 and 12 hours of time gathering research or gathering data, talking to agents, talking to potential buyers or sellers, verifying data we found in the MLS to make sure that it's appropriately entered into the MLS and we're using the correct data. So there's a lot of time that goes into that. And like for my market, I have to figure out, we have 2,500 named lakes in my little area that we cover. They all have different values. Parts are chains, some are not on chains. There's a lot of factors that go into that. And so we do a lot of research with the shoreline, the slope, the site, those things. So our appraisals take much longer, but in an area where you have a cookie cutter neighborhood or developer built market, the homes there might be 10 different style homes in this one neighborhood, all of similar square footage, age, room count, everything like that. An appraiser might be able to go out and look at a property and turn that around within 3 to 4 hours. But it's just all based on that market.
And the complexity of the property, I suppose.
Correct.
So do you ever end up going to do an appraisal where maybe the home is under construction?
Yes, it's not typically as common. And there's a couple factors with that. Generally, a lender will want us to have a as-is value and then a value as complete. So it can be a much larger appraisal, more time-consuming appraisal, more costly appraisal, because we actually have to do that appraisal based on it being finished and then back out of it what's not finished. And then generally speaking, there's always going to be a market reaction to a home not being finished. So if it's put on the market as of that day, unfinished, a buyer is going to have to come in and hire a builder to finish it. They may need to be into the home quickly, so they may have to actually move into the home and then hire a builder and live in the home while it's being under construction. So there's factors that in the market play how they react to that. Typically speaking, though, lenders will want us to do it subject to completion. And we're basing our value based on the finished product.
And then when the property is complete, is the appraisal updated or?
That depends on the lender and the lender requirements and potentially the loan. But generally the lender will hire us back to go back and do a completion in which we are checking that everything is done as it was said to be done per the appraisal. If there are changes or things aren't finished the way they are, a lot of times a whole new appraisal will be done to come up with a new valuation based on that new effective date of what's actually there.
Okay. So in your opinion, Chris, I know for lenders, we have specific timeframes that appraisals are good for, but in your opinion, how relevant is, or how long is an appraisal relevant? Or does it just depend upon what's going on in the market?
Again, that's kind of a loaded question, but I'll go through.
I told you I was putting you in the hot seat today.
I know. An appraisal really, in all actuality, is only good for that effective date. So the date that we assign the value and we sign the property, that appraisal is really only good for that day. However, that's not a realistic answer. Certain markets move much faster than other markets. In the 2005, 6, 7 market, in parts of Florida, in parts of California, in parts of Vegas, New York, there were property change values by the week. And so, and it might be 1%, 2%. I know Vegas was pretty steady for a long time at almost 3% per month. So in those cases, that appraisal is only good for that time change in a market. Prior to the boom here in 2020, we would typically say in our market up here, because we're a seasonal market, that an appraisal is good for 1 year. Within that 1 year period of time, because the market change was not that great. And then we would have data to go from season to season. So from one summer season to the next summer season would be the trend that we could determine changes in value, but not much occurred over the winter. So that appraisal would be good for longer.
Yeah, you guys are frozen solid up there in the winter. Nothing happens, right?
Yep. Nope. Not much happens up in the winter.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about, in our world, we talk about safety and soundness concerns on a daily basis. From an appraiser perspective, when you're going into a home, can you highlight for our listeners what kind of things they need to pay attention to that could potentially, be noted or drawn attention to within the report and how it might impact their loan?
So with a conventional loan, there's certain criteria that we look at. And then if you go past that into a government-backed VA, FHA, USDA loan, those have different criteria as well. But for the conventional loan, we're looking, like you said, safety concerns, soundness, and we're looking at the structure and saying, okay, does the structure, from what we can see in our casual viewing of the property, does it meet all the requirements of a safely constructed dwelling or garage or whatever improvements are on the property? We also then look at, are anything out of the ordinary unsafe, and more so from either a unknowing potential buyer or property owner, or from a child standpoint. Railings around decks are very common. There's state code that require railings at a certain deck height. Well, if that doesn't have that railing, then that could be a safety issue if someone could fall off the deck and hurt themselves. While the home may have been built prior to the code, it's still a safety issue because that person could still fall. So there's things that we look at within a property that say, for a typical person and or potentially a child, is there something that sticks out that's not safe? Is there a bow in the foundation? Is there some rot from either weather-related rot, termites, bugs? Is there damage to the property that hasn't been fixed and now is creating a possibility of a safety issue or soundness issue from decay or weather getting into the home? There's a lot of times that we see homes that have missing siding and nothing protecting that OSB or plywood from the outside, and it's starting to rot. Well, that's a safety concern because is mold and mildew getting into the home from the exterior? Is the actual structure being damaged from that lack of repair or maintenance? So there's a lot of things that go into that safety and soundness issue. Above and beyond that, then when you get into FHA, HUD, USDA, VA stuff, they're looking for even more things, typically peeling paint, chipped paint, which would be prior to 1978 for the lead-based factor. They are looking for any kind of electrical things that might be undone. Instance, you go down in the basement and there's a light fixture that's broken and there's just two wires hanging out of the light fixture that are not capped off or enclosed. That could be a safety issue if someone would actually touch those wires and electrocute themselves. So there's those kind of factors that we look at. Are the deck railings or deck stairs, the stairs inside the home, is everything adequate and safe? So we just kind of look at all of that stuff, but we kind of look at it from a standpoint of what's that typical buyer going to be looking at as well.
Yeah, because they don't want to end up with a property that they're going to have to do a whole bunch of fixes on or is in
Correct.
poor condition. And you always notate on the full report the condition of the property. For those of you listening that have read an appraisal, it's a C1, C2, C3, C4. Can you just tell us a little bit, Chris, like what what do those stand for? What do those levels mean?
Sure. So years ago, I think now we're at 12 years since they changed all of our rating guiding. We have all the same ratings as appraisers across the country. The homes within the market can have a different rating, but from the standpoint, we still have to use that common rating system. So there's 6 quality ratings, Q1 through 6, and there's 6 condition ratings, C1 through C6. A C1 condition rating is a brand new built house or a house that's under construction or proposed that has never been lived in within a year's time of it being finished. Past that, so if it's a brand new house and I am the owner of this house and I just moved into it, I've been there for one night, it's no longer a C1 rating because it's now been lived in. So that rating changes to a C2 automatically. Then from there, your C2 is a fairly new home under like new condition. From there, it moves on to it can be a new home or somewhat new home to an older home for a C3, maybe something that's been very well maintained, but no major updates or remodeling, but still very well maintained. And typically speaking, within that 20-year age range.
Effective age?
Yes.
Okay.
And then from there you go on, past there's like a C4 is going to be more of maybe an older home, 20 years and plus, depending on the market, that has been maintained, but has had no major updates. And when I'm saying major updates, I mean kind of like what the market is looking at for a major update. Flooring, furnace, some of the short-lived components of the home, furnace, water heater, appliances. Maybe there's just been a trend in building and has the home been remodeled to show the new trends of what the market is. Then that condition rating will go to a 5 and then a 6. And typically your 5 and 6, you have a older home, deferred maintenance. At a level 6, it may not even be habitable anymore, or the effects of the condition will alter the use of the property one way or the other.
Those are cash purchases, right? Investor purchase properties.
Yes.
Those are ones that are it's very, very difficult to finance.
Correct. Most lenders will not borrow on a home that is a Q6 or a C6 rating. A lot of lenders won't even do that for a C5 conditioned home, just because there has basically been no updates, maintenance, or remodeling to that home. And then from that standpoint, from the appraisal standpoint, I should say, is very hard for us to find comparables like that as well, and what effect on value that all has.
So for folks that are interested in potentially listing their house, and a prospective buyer may need to have an appraisal done, can you point out some things, maybe the top 5 things that they should pay attention to in getting ready to list their home? Things that come to mind for me, like one thing we see is curling and cup shingles, and maybe the seller doesn't even realize it's an issue, but it becomes an issue.
Yeah. So
how could they proactively plan and prepare so that they don't have any on a used house, so that they don't have issues when it comes to the appraisal?
a couple of things with that, and the market's going to dictate that to those owners, more so than what I'm going to say, but what I'm going to say is going to kind of build into that. So like to the roof, look at your roof, see what the life expectancy of it is. So even from that standpoint, if you have curled and cupped shingles, or the shingles are 30 years old and it's a 25-year-old shingle, it's past its life. So typically speaking, us as appraisers are going to note that tell you as the lender that, hey, this roof is past its useful life, you're going to typically come back and say, okay, this needs to be replaced prior to purchase, because we don't want to borrow money onto a home that is going to have a faulty roof. With that also being said, there's a lot of times where buyers coming into a home would not be able to afford a new roof if it did start to leak, which then puts more risk on the improvements as a whole. But going into some of that more, if that potential buyer or seller is saying, okay, what do I need to do? Right now, the market, in my market, in a lot of markets that I'm talking to other appraisers, other agents in, people are looking for updated homes. They want updated flooring. They want updated bathrooms. Many are looking for an updated kitchen. It's a very common thing that we're seeing right now, that you might have a 30-year-old home. The market in a lot of cases is looking for that kitchen that's been remodeled. Obviously, years ago, there was a huge push in granite countertops. Parts in Vegas, California, other parts of the country, if you didn't have granite countertops, people wouldn't even look at your house in some cases. So some of those trends are going to be a factor for a potential seller to say, okay, is this something that I want to invest in to make my home more modern to the trends of the market, to potentially sell the property faster or for more? Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think that it does. Yeah. Do borrowers always have to get an appraisal?
Not always. It depends on we do a lot of, see a lot of sales that are cash buyers. So especially up in our market right now, they want to get into that lakefront property as fast as possible. And they are willing to take the risk of not getting an appraisal or getting inspections. And they pay cash for that lakefront property to get closing done and moved within 30 days or less. But in most cases, if somebody is going to get an appraisal, needs lending or financing, they're going to have to get an appraisal in most cases. There's things that have come out since COVID, since the start of the 2020 market to now, that have tried to lessen the requirements for certain borrowers that may not need an appraisal. But in my rural market, I have not seen that very much. And the limited amounts I have, it seems like we still end up coming back and doing an appraisal.
Yes, we have a question. Do appraisers know the asking price prior to the appraiser coming in? And do they try to, like, if you were an appraiser and you knew the house was 300,000, that's what the price was going to be. Do you try to get to that price or work with that price? Or does that have no effect on when you're doing appraisal?
So that's probably one of the most common questions we get as appraisers, I think. Yes, we do know.
That's a good one.
We do know the asking price and the agreed upon price of the offer. We actually have to review the offer and that contract in the appraisal. Now, a lot of people always say, oh, you appraisers just go out there and hit that value, whatever that value is. And I'd have to say, I completely disagree with that, especially in today's market. There's so many times that I'm either coming in far below that purchase price, or in some cases way above it, just based on what the comparables are of that market for that property in that time frame. But most appraisers don't use that as any kind of necessarily tool for the valuation. We strictly go out, look at the property, find comparables and see what they've sold for. If the market is a reasonable market and everybody involved in that transaction has done their job, so the seller is a typically motivated seller and expecting a typically motivated price, the buyer is a typically motivated buyer and willing to pay a typical price. And then the listing agent has done their research and looking at the comparables, doing a market analysis. All of our valuations and conclusions should come relatively close to each other. Now, in today's market with bidding wars and whatnot, there's a lot of change there. Property might be listed, and I'm just going to use numbers, at 200,000, goes on the market. There's only one of these homes available, but there's 10 people looking for this home. They get into a bidding war and it goes up to $250,000. Well, that price of 200 where it was started at was probably the market value price. The bidding war drove the price up. But in the case of all of those potential buyers, all of those buyers would have been happy paying 200,000 for it where it was listed. It just didn't happen. So that drive and that bidding war didn't necessarily increase the value of the property. It did to those potential buyers looking at it, but the market value still remained the same. So in cases like that, we're seeing a lot of times where the appraised value is most likely going to be below that pending purchase price that we get to see.
Sure. Another question I have is, what constitutes a bedroom? Sometimes people will include 4 bedrooms, but there's no windows in that bedroom, or it's in the basement. Can you just touch on that a little bit on what a bedroom is really constituted as?
Sure, and that goes to the market that the property is in as well. But typically speaking, you have above grade finishings and below grade finishings. And with below grade, that would mean any part of the house that is below the surface of the ground. That would then be considered a basement. So code in Wisconsin is different. And then there's also certain codes within an actual city for what a bedroom is below grade. But typically speaking, you have to have a certain size window in a basement bedroom that I believe is within 40, it's either 44 inches or 42 inches from the ground would be the start of the window. And I believe it's 24 by 32 inch size window to make that a legal bedroom with ingress and egress access to the outside. And if there's a window well, they typically have to have a ladder or some system to get up out of the window well and away from the home.
Does a closet affect it, Chris?
So that used to be a factor. FHA got rid of the closet requirement, and when they did that, pretty much the secondary market guideline did the same thing. So a bedroom does not necessarily have to have a closet, but it does have to have a legal window to be able to exit the home from. So there's a lot of cases where there's a lot of people that believe that, oh, I have a bedroom in my basement and it has a walkout basement, but the bedroom doesn't have a window, but it's got access to the outside through this walkout access. That doesn't count as a bedroom. The bedroom still has to have direct egress and ingress access to the outside. So that bedroom still has to have a window to the outside, even though it's walkout. Now, if the bedroom was in the part of the home that has the actual walkout opening, then that would be fine. But they did get away from closets just because the market as a whole has somewhat trended away from closets. A lot of people are doing dressers or more like a loft style open closet with closet rods and maybe sliding doors and stuff like that. So the actual closet itself isn't necessarily makes or breaks a bedroom.
It's more the window.
Yep. And in some markets, maybe it is. Maybe in some markets, you better have a closet in that home to make that a bedroom.
Do they have to have a door to be a bedroom? I mean, would it have to have a door?
Wouldn't have to have a door. That's going to be somewhat up to the appraiser themselves. but it can't be a walk-through room. So I can't walk through one room and call that a bedroom to get to another room and have that a bedroom as well. If it's a walk-through room, even if it had doors, that's not a bedroom. Because your typical bedroom, you're not going to walk through a bedroom to go to another room in the house. It's going to be its own entity.
Got it. Can you talk a little bit about how below grade square footage is valued versus above grade square footage finished?
Sure. And this is probably the other major factor that we see as appraisers versus real estate agents versus the market and lenders. On an appraisal, we have to separate above grade and below grade. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. The form has it there. We have above grade room count, above grade square footage. We have below grade room count, below grade square footage. And we have to separate those two out. Where a real estate agent might come into something and say, okay, there's 1,200 square feet on the main level, 1,200 square feet in the basement. And they're both levels are finished. You have a 2,400 square foot home that has 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. We have to break it apart. We can't do our evaluation based on that because the below grade area has less value than the above grade area. And the reason for that is because the above grade area has more finishings than the below grade, meaning it has a roof structure, it has the shingles, it typically has more windows, it has siding, doors, all of that. And then that's also typically then where the market places most value on it. So from an appraisal standpoint, we have to separate those out from above grade to below grade. And then when we're finding comparables, we try to find comparables that have similar square footage above grade and below grade and similar square finished basements and or rooms.
How do you determine the adjustments that are given when you have 2 properties? You've determined that you can use this property as a comparable, but maybe the square footage is just a little bit different, or the lot size is different. How do you go about coming up with the adjustments in order to come out with that value?
So that goes back to the market itself. Certain markets will have better data than other markets. Going back to that cookie cutter neighborhood or that developer built neighborhood, you're going to have probably more sales, more comparables, and more things that are more common within a very short distance from that property, to where you can say, okay, in this neighborhood, homes that have 3 bedrooms are selling for $300,000 to $350,000. But a 4-bedroom home is going to sell for $360,000. So you can pull that data out and say, okay, it looks like a bedroom in that market or that neighborhood has about a $10,000 value. In other markets, and same with garages, bathrooms, age of the homes, you pull that to look to see what the market's willing to pay for that feature. And that's how we make our adjustments, is based off of that paired sales factor. Now, in other markets like mine up here, I don't have very many homes that have been built the exact same size, same design, by the same builder, in the same street, just because we're such a rural market that people build custom homes, and most homes are custom to that individual owner who built it. So from there, we try to use a paired sales data factor, but we can't always use it because it's not present. So we might use a sensitivity analysis and say, okay, I have these 5 sales, they have 3 bedrooms, and I have these 5 sales that have 4 bedrooms, and they're all fairly close in size. Is there a value difference between all of these 3-bedroom homes compared to the 4-bedroom homes? And in many cases, there might be. In many cases, there might be no difference. And so then that will dictate what our adjustment is.
Okay.
We also will look at many times, and especially right now, cost. What is a cost of a difference between a 2-car garage and a 3-car garage? I may not have a whole bunch of sales that have 3-car garages, but I know it's going to cost X to have a 3-car garage versus 2-car garage. So maybe I make an adjustment based on a cost factor minus some depreciation. So there's a lot of,
Sounds kind of complex.
yes, there's a lot that goes into the overall adjustments made based on this. And then we have, you have square footage, you have room counts, you have bathrooms, you have garages, fireplaces, some of the amenities we talked about before. You have quality, you have condition. In some cases, we can just do a straight line adjustment showing, okay, this house has had updates of, kitchen, bathroom, dining, roof, windows, doors. There's a whole list of stuff, and it had a cost of $50,000. In some cases, based on how the market is and what data we have, we might be able to say, okay, this house has all of these updates. These comparables don't. We're going to make that adjustment based on that cost.
And then you could still use that property as a comparable,
Yep. And then,
potentially.
yes. And say, okay, these are all showing that this factor, this cost factor is a trend right now in the market because this is what everybody's doing. So there's a lot of research that goes into us looking at the subject property, plus then every single comparable that we are considering.
Right. I know we're not in a market right now where you see a lot of seller concessions, but I would like to just address seller concessions that sometimes come up in the offer where, maybe the seller will agree to pay X amount of dollars towards buyers, prepaids and closing costs or something like that. How do seller concessions affect the appraised value?
That is also dictated by the actual market and how common the concessions are. So like you just said, you might see something that says the seller is willing to pay X amount or a percentage towards closing cost or whatever. We have to look at that and factor, has that concession actually affected the final price of the property? And is this concession something that is now opening a larger buyer's pool for that property? In some markets where they're developer built market, where they have 80 parcels in that development and there's one builder, that builder might do a concession and say, hey, if you close on a home in the next 30 days, we're going to throw in furniture and a TV and stuff like that. But we have to figure out, okay, did that property now sell? Was it on the market prior to this concession being offered? And did it sell now because that concession was there? And then if so, how did that affect that final price or that property actually sold if it was already listed without a concession? But for the most part, it really dictates what that market is seeing and how that affects the outcome of the appraisal. Your typical seller willing to contribute a certain percentage doesn't normally have a big play in the overall valuation if it's within reason. There's some concessions that we have seen that the seller will pay up to $15,000 back to the buyer. Well, at that point, I have to question, that's way more than what's typical. If $10 is normally seen and now we have a $15,000 thing, what's going on?
Can you let us know? Because I want to know what property they're giving $15,000 in a concession.
So what we've seen is what happens is, I'm going to use numbers here. property was listed for 150. It's now selling for 175. But there's concessions back to the buyer of $25,000. But the purchase price is 175. So they're just trying to get a higher purchase price or potential appraisal to show that purchase price and then get money back. And maybe that concession money comes back and is it reapplied as a down payment. So they're just trying to work numbers to potentially get that potential buyer into that home. So in those cases like that, all they're doing is switching numbers, and so that buyer is getting more money up front to turn around and give that money right back to or the seller is getting more money up front to turn around and give that money right back to the buyer.
Which creates a problem, especially from a
Yes.
lender side as well.
Yep. And so we have to look at that and say, okay, well, that doesn't make sense whatsoever. And we're going to do our valuation based on our valuation. But by people doing that, it can definitely screw up a loan.
Well, we're almost at
Really?
11 o'clock.
Yeah.
Do you want to start wrapping it up, Angela?
Yep, that's what I was just gonna do. Yeah, we've gone through an awful lot of information today. Chris, thank you so much. You're a wealth of knowledge and I appreciate you taking the time to join us. Hopefully for those of you that are out there online that were listening, you found value in having this conversation. We just hear all the time that consumers are just so confused by the appraisal process or maybe don't trust it. I can tell you after 23 years of being in this business, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of value to having an appraisal done. For those of you that are out there buying properties, I know that right now the market is, a little bit anti with inspections and appraisals. And so if we have real estate agents on there, please plug your ears, but an appraisal really is a valuable piece of information for a buyer. So we appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us and logging in. I want to remind everybody on the call that we currently have a fantastic promotion going on right now where we can close your loan in 20 days if you could find a property that will close that fast. And then of course, just, if there are any other questions, now would be a great time to pipe up and unmute and ask those questions before we sign off. You see anything out there, Kim?
I don't. But
No.
can they reach out to you or Chris afterwards?
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. I would just say funnel questions through me. And then I would get those, over to Chris and he can answer them and we'll get the answers back out to the customer.
Great. Thank you.
I have one
everyone.
question, if we have a moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Carol. I'm in the Woodruff area and we're in the process of closing through a VA loan. And I was wondering if Chris has any direct experience doing appraisals for VA loans.
I do not currently do anything with VA right now. They go under HUD, which is basically the same as FHA. It's just, they are two different programs, but pretty much governed under HUD. I do FHA appraisals. So VA and FHA are very similar. And the guidelines for what is required on that appraisal are very similar as well.
Wouldn't you say though, Chris, that VA is maybe even a little less intense than FHA?
Yes and no. I think they're very close. USDA is actually less intense, especially for the state of Wisconsin, because USDA loans will allow local guidance,
So
facts and stuff like that with regards to well, septic, some of that things where FHA does not. Even though they're all governed under HUD, USDA has a little bit more lenience because it's based on a rural environment.
back to the VA loan part of it, do you have a list then or does the appraiser have a list that they go into the house with and check as they go? Or is it just anecdotal documentation?
No, we have to follow HUD's handbook 4000.1. So there are
Is
certain,
that something I can Google?
Yes.
You can, yes. It's very large.
Yeah.
So that handbook has things in it with regards to the underwriting of the loan, the lender requirements within the loan, the submission of the loan. It then also has the appraisal application of the loan for that. I think the last time I looked, it's 500 or 600 pages long.
Okay,
The appraisal part of it, I think, is right around 100 and some pages, plus or minus.
I'll breeze through it.
Yeah, I mean, but the big things that we look for on those loans are the safety, soundness, and structural issues.
Right.
Peeling paint, and that can be anything with on the property. So if the house, say the garage is on the home and it was built in 1970, but you have a brand new house that's on this property, but the house is 1970, that property in its entirety falls under that 1978 guideline of peeling paint. So anything on that property that has peeling paint, chip paint, that would have to have a correction done to it, even if it's on the house that was built brand new. We look at the electrical aspects of things, especially in the basement. Are there exposed wires? Are wires run under the floor joists? Are they not enclosed in boxes? We look at the handrail issue, not necessarily on the interior stairs because HUD got away from that, but we look at on decks, patios, doorways heading out of a home. Is there a deck there? Is there a landing there? Is there proper handrails on those things?
When you're in those circumstances, do you have a trend one way or the other if people follow through and try and get them fixed and closed, or if they bail?
Typically speaking, what I see is the buyer and seller come together and try to come up with some negotiation to have those items cured, fixed.
Cool.
It's not always the case. There's a lot of times where deals just fall through because this person's not willing to do this or that. And there's a lot of times where any kind of correction has to actually come up, that borrower has to come up with the money and or means to make that correction prior to closing.
Thank you.
Carol, that's also where your real estate agents come in and play a huge part in the negotiation because they're there to keep that deal together. So
Right.
hopefully your real estate agents on both sides are doing some of that negotiation.
Yeah, we're still waiting for the appraisal to happen. We just
got
started
it.
this process like a week ago. So
Okay, cool.
thank you.
Mhm.
Yep.
Any other questions out there in Zoom land before we wrap up here?
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you guys all for joining. We appreciate it. Certainly reach out for any questions that you might have surrounding the appraisal, and we'll try to get you those responses back as soon as possible. And have an incredible day.